to Leadership Greater Madison Summit on Homelessness in Dane County. My name is Phil Bauer. I'm with the law firm of White, Hirschbeck, Dudek here in Madison, and I'm a member of the Leadership Greater Madison Social Services team. On behalf of our team, we're really happy that you could join us today. I do have a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Probably heard these before, but if you could silence your cell phones, we'd appreciate it. And I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my fellow LGM Social Services team members. If you guys could wave when I say your name. We have Martin Day from Madison Gas and Electric, David De Leon from Alliant Energy, Kelly Donahue from the Madison Police Department, Sarah Sosa Acevedo with the Madison Children's Museum, Pat Steele with the Northport Community Learning Center, and Patrick Sweeney with the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. I'd also like to thank our summit sponsors for helping make this summit possible. They are the Alliant Energy Foundation, In on the Park, Madison Gas and Electric Foundation, and White Hirschbeck Dudek. I'd also like to recognize some of our local elected officials who are with us here today. They include Dane County Supervisor Mary Kohler and Madison Common Council Alders Sue Ellingson, John Strasser, and Liddell Zellers. And also a special thanks to the Greater Madison Chamber of Commerce and Wood Communications Group for coordinating the Leadership Greater Madison program. So why are we here today? Every year, as part of its leadership training and development curriculum, Leadership Greater Madison participants select an important community issue and develop a project to address that issue and to make a difference in the community. Earlier this year, our social services team began researching homelessness in Dane County, and while we quickly learned that there were a lot of amazing people and groups doing amazing things in this community, we also heard that there was a need to bring people from across the board together to sit down and talk about what we as a community can do. So that's what prompted today's summit. To give us a little background on the realities of homelessness in Dane County, and to talk us through what will happen today and introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to welcome NBC 15's Lee Mills. PM anchor at NBC 15. She joined NBC 15 10 years ago and was a reporter before beginning her anchoring duties. She's received numerous awards for her in-depth reporting.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you bright and early. I'm still kind of, I go to bed around 1 or 2 a.m. So whether I would be interested in tackling the issue of homelessness earlier this year, it really felt like a big undertaking because, as you all know, and that's why we're gathered here today, it's an issue that continues to grow, even though we have so many people involved in tackling this issue. And so I really gave it a lot of thought, and I pitched the series to my boss, and they, because I've been there 10 years, but one of the good things about getting older in TV news is that you have a little more clout and you can convince your boss to give you a little more time to cover issues you're interested in. So I was really excited that he allowed me to do it, and I spent a lot of time interviewing people in the community, profiled a homeless family, and profiled a homeless single woman, and I various presenters about local programs and efforts to eliminate homelessness. Okay. It is now my honor to introduce today's keynote speaker, Steve Berg. Steve is the Vice President for Programs and Policy with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The Alliance is nonpartisan. It is a mission-driven national agency committed to preventing and ending homelessness in the U.S. And they take a three-pronged approach to addressing this issue. Number one, improving homelessness policy. 2, building on-the-ground capacity. And finally, educating opinion leaders. Active in helping develop national policy and in assisting the Alliance's work with organizations and communities across the country. So please give a warm welcome to Steve Berg.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be here. As I was talking to my wife the other night, we spent a short time in Madison, Wisconsin back in 1982, lived here for a while, and just care about the people who are the least among us, if you will. And it's great to be back. We got a little bit about the National Alliance to End Homelessness, just so people aren't familiar with us. We're a national organization. We work with people all over the country on the issue of homelessness, trying to get better practices going. Can you hear me okay? No. Is this mic working? It is. I'll talk louder. We're working with communities all over the country, big cities, small towns, state, local government, to get better approaches to homelessness implemented. We back that up with work with the federal government to incentivize good practices, to make more funding available, and also just try to educate the public about the issue of homelessness. We do conferences every year. We have a conference coming up in New Orleans in February. If you're interested in that, in DC. I always say what I'm about to say because it usually gets a laugh from the crowd, but I guess I mean it more. It is good to get out of Washington. I was on my phone this morning sort of looking at the latest give and take in Congress and White House and trying not to have the whole economy, I think, really reflects the fact that we have a system of government, the structure of the federal government is set up so that you can't really do anything unless there's a consensus. A bare majority doesn't get you very far in order to do things. You need to have a consensus about what to do. And right now in this country, there's a lot of big issues where there just really isn't a consensus. There's like 50.5% of the people believe one way and 49.5% of the people believe another way on all kinds of issues. Big issues like what the role of the federal government should be. And that has caused a lot of gridlock, a lot of problems with what the government in Washington, D.C. can do. I'm happy to work in a field, however, where there is maybe more consensus than on a lot of issues. When I go around the country, when I talk to people, Republicans, Democrats, people, business people, people in the public sector, there's a lot of agreement that the existence of widespread homelessness, of veterans, of people with disabilities, of families with children, living on the streets, living in the back seats of cars, living in abandoned buildings, it just is not becoming to a country such as ours to have those kind of circumstances for people with the lowest incomes. Again, preaching to the choir in this group, I think where the problem is not so much that people don't believe this is a bad problem or don't believe we should do something about. The problem with homelessness, what I've found, is that people don't really believe, too many people don't really believe you can do anything about it. Homelessness became a regular thing in this country in the early 80s, during the bad economy in the early 80s. And I think before then, there wasn't really widespread homelessness, but it's been so long now. When the economy got better in the 80s, homelessness didn't get better for a range of different reasons. And it's been so long now that people have just gotten used to the idea that there's lots of people living on the streets. So it just begs the question, can you do anything? Can you do anything about homelessness? Can you end homelessness? Well, I work for a group called the National Alliance to End Homelessness, so you probably can get from that what I think about that question. And in fact, I think, yes, it is possible to end homelessness. And I think we're in recent years, as I'll talk about in a minute, we've come a long way toward doing just that. Just let me start by saying this. In theory, anyway, there are many different ways you could end homelessness. A country as rich as ours could end homelessness. One way would be to take an approach that doesn't really focus on homelessness, but focuses on housing more generally. We could treat housing the way we treat education, or the way we treat having roads to drive on, or the way we treat national defense. We could just say, well, it's going to be a an accepted fact that in this country, housing is going to be something everyone has, like education is something everyone has, like roads to drive on is something everyone has. And we'll have structures set up in the government to make sure that everyone can get housing they can afford. There are many people working toward that goal. I mean, I would say at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, we're doing what we can to move toward that goal. People familiar with the National Housing Trust Fund campaign that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition has run. There's national organizations, people working in communities all over who are trying to meet that bigger goal of housing affordability for everyone. I would say that that is turning out to be a long-term project for those who are trying to work on it. It's something that we don't have a big consensus about. It involves amounts of government spending that there is no consensus to do. So as much as we work on it, we work very hard in Washington on things like getting more funding for the Section 8 program for people who are familiar with that. The trust fund campaign I referred to before. But again, there's not, we have not achieved any kind of consensus that sort of affordable housing goal is one we can all meet. So we continue to work on it. But in the meantime, there are people living in the street. There are children, veterans, people with disabilities, living in the back seats of their car, living in the situations we've talked about. And so there are many of us who believe that while we work on longer term issues of justice and housing affordability, right now we've got an emergency situation, we have a crisis situation. People living in the street is not something that we should look at as though as there's a long-term problem that we need a long-term solution to. It is instead something that needs to be treated as an emergency. I mean, if it was my children, it would be an emergency for me. But I think one of the things about homelessness becoming sort of a common practice is that there's a certain loss of the sense of urgency by a lot of people, again, based on that idea that, well, you can't really do anything about it. So, is there a way to really look at this problem and say, can we solve this problem? Can we not just manage the problem? Can we solve the problem of homelessness in a way that will achieve the kind of consensus that it needs in order to do that? And I would say, from looking around the country, from looking at communities who are working on this, from talking about this issue in Congress and in the last 3 administrations, I would say the answer is yes. Yes, there is a consensus that ending homelessness is worth doing, and there is a developing approach, a new approach to homelessness that has risen up over the last 10 years that can solve the problem. I say it's a new approach, but it's not, for people who are working in the field, the elements of it aren't that things people have been talking about, things communities that have been getting the best results have been doing for a long time. But I think it's still not something that the general public is that aware of, but we're trying to make them more aware of it. And one of the things that's helping is just some of the results we've seen. HUD, since 2005, HUD has asked communities to do these one-night counts of homeless people. You know, you can argue about whether that's a valuable use of time. I think it's turned out to be a very valuable use of time, just because it focuses people on the extent of the problem and on what's going on with it. By looking back to 2005 and having a relatively consistent way of enumerating homeless people in those years, we can look at it and say, well, we had, in the years before this last recession hit, we were actually reducing homelessness fairly rapidly throughout the country. And furthermore, during a time of intense economic downturn, where unemployment went very high. The last time unemployment was that high was in the 1980s. That was when homelessness emerged on the scene as a national problem. We were expecting the same thing this time. A few years ago, we even wrote a paper that said, well, if the unemployment rate goes up to where we think it's going to go up to, homelessness will become much worse. There will be thousands, millions more people homeless if nobody does anything about it. Well, the economy did get just as bad as people were expecting, but we haven't had, on a national level, big increases in homelessness. There have been communities that have had that, but on a national level, there has not been. And that's because people did do something about it. I mean, partly the federal government did something about it in some of the legislation that came out of the recession. There were big new resources for communities to deal with homelessness. But it wasn't just that. It was also the way communities were dealing with the problem. This new approach that I'm about to talk about that was what was being funded, and that was what communities were doing, and that's why we don't have, 1.5 million homeless people. We're still down around 600,000, and that's been, even since the recession started, slowly creeping down. So what does this new approach consist of? I mean, overall, the main point, the main talking point about this is it's about meeting a goal. It's about actually reducing the number of homeless people very quickly and getting it down as close to zero as possible. There's been a lot of work done on homelessness since the early 80s. A lot of it is what I would call taking care of homeless people. Taking care of homeless people is very important work. People living on the streets are very vulnerable to crime, to sickness, to disease, and to death. And there has to be community-wide efforts to get people off the street, get people into shelter, provide the health care people need to help them get through this crisis. But taking care of people while they're homeless is not ending homelessness. It's an important thing to do, but it's not the whole story. The new approach to homelessness is about really going beyond the goal of taking care of homeless people, going beyond, as my boss Nan Roman says, going beyond the goal of managing the problem of homelessness and really ending homelessness. So how do you do that? How do you do that? There's three key things I want to talk about here this morning that communities that have been getting the best results have been doing, that people around the country have been doing, that are more and more being written into federal policies about homelessness. And then I would suggest that people here who want to make a big difference in this community really look at. Okay, the first thing, of these three, the first thing is a local system that's about getting results. Now in every community in the country, there are lots of programs. But what's new, what's becoming more and more apparent to people who are working this problem around the country is that having a collection of programs is not enough. You have to have a system. You have to have people working together around certain goals where meeting those goals is the overall point of the work. There's a few aspects of this. One, a local system gets universal support. For too many years in too many places, there was a group of usually nonprofit homeless service providers, and homelessness was that was their thing, and everybody else in the community said, well, we have homeless services providers, we have a continuum of care, we have shelter, and we have, people who get together, homeless service providers who get together every month and talk about what they're going to do. That's their problem. Let them deal with that. That never happens here, right? I'll ask an uncomfortable question. But communities that are really making a difference are getting people, a much broader range of people to understand that homelessness is a problem for the whole community, and a solution is only going to happen if the whole community is behind it. So in places that have gotten the best results, it's not, the homeless services providers are of course very active, and it's a big headache because besides running a big program, then you've got to go to a bunch of meetings and worry about getting other people involved. But homeless services providers are so happy to do this because their mission is not just to run programs, but to get these results. But other people include the sort of larger anti-poverty system, the faith community, businesses have been key leaders in efforts to end homelessness around the country. Opinion leaders of all sorts, journalists, funders, people in foundations and community foundations, elected officials for sure, law enforcement, hospitals. These are all people who, like, once they think about it and talk about it and learn about it, realize they have a stake here. To get people like that involved, one of the things to know about is, and this is a little bit of a sideline, but it's an important thing to know. Homelessness is actually a very expensive problem. Leaving homeless people on the streets, the quote unquote ignoring the problem actually is very expensive for all kinds of people in communities. A good way to start building a community-wide effort to end homelessness is to take a hard look at who in the community is paying for the fact that people are homeless, and how much are they paying, and would it be, you know, just to be sort of crass about it, would it be better would their bottom line be better if homeless people were housed instead? Hospitals are a great ally in this. Somebody in every community, somebody is paying for medical care for people who are living on the streets, have emergency mental health problems, have other kinds of problems. Somebody's paying for their health care, and they're paying a lot more for their health care than would be the case if people were in stable housing and were getting stable health care and were dealing with things in a more preventive way. So hospitals are big allies. I mentioned law enforcement. Homeless people, unfortunately, go to jail a lot. Most people who run jails, most county sheriffs, sometimes it's a county sheriff, sometimes the local police department, sometimes it's a particular agency. Most people who run jails, the last thing they want to do is be taken care of, to be serving as the de facto homeless shelter in a community. But in many, many communities, that is the case, with all the problems and challenges that brings. Remember, the sheriff of Los Angeles County, a bigger place than here, said once, which is really true, he was running the biggest mental health system in the world, and that mental health system is called the Los Angeles County Jail System, because he had more people with mental illness in his jail than any other institution anywhere. Was he able to deal with that? Was he prepared as the sheriff of Los Angeles County, trained to deal with mental illness? No way. That's why he became a big supporter of work to end homelessness in the Los Angeles area. And I think the same is true of law enforcement everywhere. People in law enforcement know a lot about homelessness. They see the people, they know the people. Some of the best programs around the country are actually run by law enforcement, and law enforcement decides who gets the housing. So a big piece of this local system is getting everyone involved. Elected leaders, of course, having a mayor who's on board and who's willing to take some leadership is incredibly important. Another piece of a local system is real system level management. Again, a collection of programs is important, but to have a system that works, you need people whose job it is to look at the whole community and say, what's happening with the number of homeless people? What resources do we have? How are we strategically aligning them with the problem as it exists in our community? Which programs are going to take which clients? What are we going to invest in? What kind of program models are we going to invest in? If there's nobody asking those kind of questions, nobody looking at community-wide data and seeing what kind of outcomes you're getting, then you won't make progress. You'll have programs, but you won't have a system. That's a key learning that a lot of places have had. And finally, an agreement on goals and strategies by everybody in the system. This is incredibly important. There needs to be buy-in for the idea that this goal of reducing the number of homeless people is actually something the community does. I mean, everybody wants to do it, but there's got to be buy-in on the goal to the extent that people are willing to invest time and energy into it. And not just the overall goal, but specific strategies. Things like, for example, as I'll talk in a minute, the idea that permanent supportive housing, the most expensive kind of homeless intervention, is going to be reserved for people with the most severe disabilities and problems. That is one thing that a lot of communities have sort of adopted that as a key policy. Well, there's got to be overall buy-in to that, otherwise it will be undermined every step of the way as programs look to find easier people to serve. That the people I'm talking about are very difficult to serve, and there needs to be a lot of buy-in in order to make sure that gets done. So this idea of having system-wide agreement on goals, having system-wide agreement on strategies is a key thing. So a local system that's set up to get results. That's one important thing. The second important thing that communities that have gotten good results have done is summed up by the motto, housing first. People have heard of the housing first approach to homelessness. Different people use that different ways. In other countries, they use the word housing first, the phrase housing first, it means something completely different. In the homeless system, what housing first means is that programs are set up so that the first thing that happens when people come into a homeless system is they get into housing. Housing first, it's pretty simple. There might be different kinds of housing, what kinds of housing it is, what kind of support services are in place for people. That all gets determined later. But the key to housing first, and the key to communities that have had the best success is that if people are on the streets, if people are living in their cars, if people are in shelters, they need to get into permanent housing in the community right away. How fast that is varies in different places, but the places that do it the fastest work the best. For a long time in homeless services, what a lot of programs did is they tried to fix people's problems before the people got into housing. Keep them homeless while you're fixing their problems. In theory, that's a perfectly valid approach as well. It has just proven over the years not to work very well. For example, there was a lot of money invested in substance abuse treatment for homeless people that was delivered to people through outreach. People would be asked to come in while they were homeless, to come into a place and to get substance abuse treatment, do their therapy, and then go back to live on the street in the communities they were in. People who know homeless people, who know what living homeless is like, if you think about that, it just seems bound to fail. Or if not bound to fail, at least bound to be much, much harder than it needs to be. Whereas most people who need substance abuse treatment are not homeless. Most people who get substance abuse treatment get it while they're living in a house or an apartment. I think the substance abuse treatment field in general feels like it gets pretty good results and better all the time. But it's set up so that people have some stability in their lives, and being homeless is not stability. So that's an example. There are other examples in terms of getting a job is so much easier if you've got a place to live. Dealing with serious mental illness is so much easier if you've got a place to live. These are all things that have driven people to adopt the housing first approach. So that's and in communities that have gotten good results, housing first has been a key to that. And then the third piece, and this is probably the hardest to talk about, so I keep trying, and I'll try in a different way today, is the idea of just enough, that each homeless person gets just enough to not be homeless anymore, and not necessarily a great deal more than that. That's what the homeless system does. The work to end homelessness is about getting people just enough to not be homeless, and then moving on to the next person. The reason this is hard, it's hard for a lot of reasons. One reason it's hard just because of sort of the ethic in the helping professions. I was trained as a lawyer. I worked as a legal services lawyer for many years before coming to Washington, D.C. And I will tell you the sort of professional responsibility ideals for a lawyer are really, you've got a client, and you are to do everything you can for that client. That's your professional responsibility. Figure out ways to solve that client's problems, to get that client more advantages, to get them in a better place. That's your responsibility to your client. You do not, as a formal professional rule, you don't have any responsibility to all the people who are in line outside of your office waiting to get in and get your help. If you're a legal services lawyer, you get used to the idea there's a lot of people in line. The rules of professional responsibility are such that until they actually get through that door and sit down with you and you say, you're my client now, you don't have a responsibility to them. This is true in health professions, this is true in social work to some extent, and I think it's a way of thinking about problems that has kept us from solving the problem, because we want to do more. Rather than doing just enough, we want to do everything we can for the person in front of us. But the problem with that is that there's all those people lined up outside our door that aren't getting anything. So the communities have been making some progress with this just enough approach. It's like, our goal is to end homelessness. What is it going to take to get this person to not be homeless anymore? And then turn to the next person who's waiting for that, and so a couple of things about that. For the homeless people, this is their biggest priority. I mean, if you talk to homeless people about what do you need, what do you want, the number one priority is always, I need help getting a place to live. So if you're just doing that for everybody, you're going to do a lot more good than if you're not doing that for most people, but for a few people you're doing a lot more. So that's one thing. Another thing is, doing just enough and no more is not a completely satisfying experience for people, frankly, for people in the profession. In order for it to be more satisfying, that's part of what the whole working with the whole community is about. You have to be able to know that if you get somebody in housing, the rest of the community is going to step up and make the kind of services available that they're going to need in order to stay in housing. We don't want to put people in housing and have them be back homeless again in 2 months or 2 years even. And so part of that, the homeless services community, the effort against homelessness, needs to also talk about a larger community approach. It's about housing affordability, as I said, about getting the services in place that people need. But for the effort to end homelessness, I think this key of doing just enough and going on to the next person is a mindset that people have to look at and have to see if they can make that work. So the other thing about that is just enough. For some homeless people, just enough is going to be quite a bit. I mean, we shouldn't kid ourselves to think that there aren't homeless people who need a lot of help in order to stabilize in housing. But the point is, again, to make sure that the most expensive kinds of interventions are targeted to those people with the most severe problems and the most severe disabilities. So I'll just briefly talk about a couple of the kinds of interventions that homeless providers have sort of invented and put into place that work really well. So on the one end, we've got permanent supportive housing, as I mentioned before. This is permanent supportive housing, as people in the homeless field who are here know perfectly well, other people may not. It involves a long-term, fairly deep rental subsidy with the idea that people are not going to be able to contribute much of their own money to the rent because they don't have any money to contribute. Combined with supports, combined with efforts to make sure that the person is getting health care, is getting behavioral health care, is getting kind of connection to the whole community that can help them put behind a lot of their problems and move forward toward a better life. Now this is a model that is really designed for what somebody came up with the term chronically homeless people, which is, not my favorite term in the world, but it's in wide acceptance now. People are homeless for long periods of time with a severe disability. This is the model that's designed for those people. This is, when most people think of a homeless person, I think, most Americans who sort of don't know the issue very well, when they think of a homeless person, this is the person they're thinking of. Somebody who's lived on the street for years, somebody with a severe mental illness, often compounded by a substance abuse problem and in the range of other physical health problems. This is not, however, most people who are homeless. Most people who experience homelessness, it's an economic crisis. It's a shorter-term crisis. The people with the more severe problems need an intensive intervention, but not everybody needs that intensive intervention, which is a good thing. Otherwise, ending homelessness would cost so much money that, again, we wouldn't be able to build that consensus. For most people, a short-term intervention is more appropriate. This is something that some communities have figured out on their own a long time ago, but I think on the federal level, with the money that came out of the stimulus bill, the HPRP program, for those who are familiar with that, the housing, homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program, this model of rapid rehousing has really caught on, I think. Communities got to use it with the HPRP program. HUD is pushing it more and more. And communities that have really put it in place and really designed their systems around rapid rehousing have found that they are getting a lot of people out of homelessness. The number of homeless people, particularly families with children, is going down fast. That there is housing out there, and people can get into housing for a few months, have a few months of rent paid, and then get some help they need, getting everything stabilized, trying to find a job, getting their benefits straightened out if they get benefits. This can actually be successful in the vast majority of cases. People don't need you don't need a long-term rent subsidy up front. If you have long-term rent subsidies that you can dedicate to homelessness, then you should do that, and you should try to focus on people with the more severe problems for those long-term rent subsidies. But for most people experiencing homelessness, if they get this rapid rehousing intervention, they get housed quickly, they stay housed, they don't come back to the homeless system. Sort of amazingly enough to a lot of people who work in this system, but it just turns out that this works really well. So I think the rapid rehousing model for most homeless people and building a system that's about getting people housed quickly is key and very important. The keys to rapid rehousing, I think, again, it's about getting the community involved. Success with rapid rehousing means finding landlords who are willing to rent to homeless people. But success with permanent supportive housing also relies on finding landlords who are willing to rent to homeless people. That's not always that easy to do. So working with the landlord community is a very important piece of this. It's probably the most important thing. And working with employers is the other thing. If you get somebody in an apartment with 3 months of rent subsidy with the expectation that they're going to be able to afford the rent after 3 months, obviously employment is key to that. Most people experiencing homelessness are perfectly capable of being employed. Most people experiencing homelessness have been employed in the past. They've supported themselves in employment in the past. So the short-term rent subsidies, the working with landlords to get people rapidly rehoused, and the employment piece are keys to that. I want to stop there because I've gone on long enough, and I could talk about this stuff for weeks, months at a time. Come to our conference if you want to hear more about these things. But let me just say this. We've made some progress in this field. We've made a lot of progress in this field. We have virtually ended chronic homelessness in some places that have bought into this kind of approach. We've reduced family homelessness in some communities that have really adopted a rapid rehousing programs and a rapid rehousing system. We've seen family homelessness go down by 30, 40, 50% over a couple of years' time. These are things that get results. People working in the veterans field and with veterans homelessness, right now we're in a situation with the rollout of the most recent round of rapid rehousing programs for veterans, where I believe the federal government has come up with enough money to provide the appropriate homelessness intervention to every single homeless veteran in the country. And once this gets cranked up, if communities do the community-wide planning thing that I talked about before, if they do that, then we will see incredible, breathtaking reductions in veterans homelessness over the next couple of years, because the resources are on the table. Congress has put the resources on the table. And if communities can work together, if the VA and shelters and service providers and employers and landlords can all work together, we'll get great results. HUD is trying to do the same thing with all homeless people, starting with chronically homeless, as you know, families with children after that, youth, unaccompanied youth. They need help from communities. They need help from communities willing to get everybody together, maybe try some new things, maybe look at what they've been doing in the past and really be honest with ourselves about what hasn't worked so well, look at what other communities are doing and see what is working well there. This is a problem that we can solve. We are solving it. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can do it, and I'm glad to see people here who are ready to put the time and energy into it, so thank you very much. If you want to, I'm told we have a little time for questions, so.
Usually ladies go first, but I'll take a swing at this first. My name is Jeff Kostelik. I work for the Dane County Executive, and as was mentioned, I used to serve on the Dane County Board as well. I just want to walk through some of the things that Dane County does as it relates to providing services for those who are homeless or those who are at risk of becoming homeless. Anytime putting together a list like this, we run into some pitfalls because there are gray areas. People might say some of the things I mentioned, well, that has nothing to do with homelessness, but have to draw the line somewhere. And so some of these things kind of hit the homeless issue tangentially, but I hope it provides a pretty good list of the effort we're putting forth now in terms of our core homeless service programming, things that we proposed and are implementing this year, and some of the things that are in the County Executive's 2014 budget. Some of the core services that Dane County provides are to the YWCA. We help fund some of their sheltering program, and we also help fund some of their partnership programs with the Road Home and their Housing First programs in Stoughton. We also provide funding to Torchlight, who provides the drop-in shelter known as Hospitality House, and also the emergency shelters that are run out of Grace Episcopal for single men. We also provide funding to the Salvation Army. They provide sheltering for women and families on East Washington Avenue and also some on Darrow. We also provide funding to the Road Home for housing services, the Tenant Resource Center as well for referrals and maintenance of affordable housing lists and advocacy for people who have housing but are having some issues with some of the legal pitfalls associated with tenants' rights. And we also provide funding to the Community Action Coalition of Southern Wisconsin. That's mainly to help run their food pantry and some other supportive services to people who are either homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. In total, those services and other minor ones total about $1.5 million annually for the sort of core homeless services that Dane County provides or helps fund. New in 2013, we helped provide some funding to the Youth Services of Southern Wisconsin to fix a federal funding glitch that they experienced, and we bridged the gap to 2014, and they helped provide services to homeless and runaway youth. We also set aside and spent over $30,000 for the operation of the Day Resource Center that operated on East Washington Avenue last winter and into the spring. We set aside $600,000 for the purchase and/or renovation of a permanent Day Resource Center, which has not happened yet because we are finding, like people who are suffering or having problems finding housing, we're having a hard time finding a Day Resource Center building that's appropriate and that fits within our budget. We hope to have something finalized soon, but we are still in the process of doing that. We also set aside $500,000 for planning and acquisition for securing SRO-style housing, and we are still in the process of doing that as well for 2013. And we set aside $250,000 for establishing a cooperative housing arrangement. And we are very close to finalizing something in that regard so that we can have a cooperative housing arrangement for people who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. New in 2014, proposed in the county executive's budget, and Natalie will talk a little bit more about this, we set aside $750,000 for the acquisition of property for the purpose of establishing low-cost efficiency housing in Madison. The community city development is in the process of putting together a plan that would ultimately, hopefully, establish about 110 low-cost efficiency housing units in Madison. We also are going to up our emergency funding for our Joining Forces for Families program to help them with eviction prevention funding for the clients they serve. Oftentimes they are approached by some of their clients who can't quite make rent, and if they can't, they risk being evicted, and we are providing $25,000 more in funding to help bridge the gap for people who are in sort of that fragile situation. We also are trying to address another avenue towards homelessness. A lot of people who are released from prison and jail don't have the resources available to them to secure housing or employment or any of the other things that are necessary to successfully reintegrate into society. And so we're creating a reentry services coordinator in the Department of Human Services that will work with our sentenced population in the jail to start working with them the day they're sentenced to the day they're released to ensure that when they get out the door, they've got an action plan about housing, employment, treatment, or whatever other services they need so that they don't end up floundering back in the criminal justice system. And finally, we are setting aside $2 million to complete the capital campaign for Days and their new domestic abuse shelter. Their current shelter is undersized and inadequate. Their new shelter will increase capacity tremendously and will really address that aspect of homelessness when we're fleeing abuse. So that kind of runs down what the county does. A lot of what I said is done in conjunction with the city, the federal government, the state government. There's a lot of funding sources that come together in streams to fund these activities. But that was sort of the county's effort. But I don't want to leave off the table all of the very good work that's done by the nonprofit and faith-based community in Dane County. They really step up and are a very important service provider as it relates to providing services to the homeless. So that's just a basic rundown of what Dane County does, and I'll turn it over to Natalie for some description of what the city is doing.
Hi, I'm Natalie Erdman with Community Development Authority of the City of Madison. I see a lot of faces that I know. And I'm really not qualified to talk about all the things that the city does to support nonprofit organizations and organizations that are...
Look at your clock. I can't believe it, we're right on time again. So you three are awesome, rock stars for multiple reasons. So what we're going to do now that we have a clear picture of homelessness in Madison and Dane County and some initiatives and goals of the city and county, we're going to move into the breakout sessions and panel discussions. 3 housekeeping items first. I know some of you were wondering about our keynote speaker change. Due to the government shutdown, that is the reason that Beverly Ebersold with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness could not join us. And I just want to once again thank Steve, who graciously agreed to step in really on short notice. A 45-minute poll is a lot, although when you do it all day long, as he mentioned, you could talk for days and weeks. But we really thank him, and I wanted to make sure everyone was clear as to why Beverly was not able to be here today. So you have an opportunity now to grab some coffee. I want to just point out the photos along both walls. Certainly take a second to look at the photo display, and then you can make your way to the first panel discussion. Reminder that panelists and room assignments are in the booklet, and then we will reconvene here at 12:20 for lunch and that presentation on human trafficking. I have to run because I have to still work over at Channel 15 today. So I just want to thank all of you for having me here for this small portion of the day. And I want to say two things. Number one, if anyone ever has a story idea, I'm only one person out of 90 people who work there, but I do have a fairly strong voice and I welcome any ideas. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen tomorrow or in the next month, but I want to know what's happening in this community, and I want to be accessible to every single person and help provide a voice for the stories that need to be told. So my email is really easy to find. You can go online. It's lmills@abc15.com. It's sometimes not the easiest for me to email back every single day because I do get a lot of emails, but I promise I read every single one and I will get back to you. So please reach out if you have anything that you'd like to suggest or provide feedback on. And secondly, as a member of the Day's Board of Trustees, I just want to echo, as we were talking about the shelter, how exciting it is, because I've been on that board for 4 years, when it was just a concept to have a shelter that wasn't a secret and that actually was able to bring in more than enough people to fill 6 rooms, which is what we have right now. The waiting list is disgustingly long, and I am so excited that we have a building and that we will be opening next year. So I want to thank every single person in this room who put forth any work to make that happen. It is truly exciting. We still have a long way to go, but I want to thank you for that. So take a break, head to the panels, and have a wonderful rest of the day.